Your rent didn't just go up by accident, it was engineered. The shrinking paycheck, the grocery bill that quietly doubles, the house you can't afford anymore. None of this is a glitch in the system, it is the system. For the last 50 years, the value of your money has been deliberately, steadily eroded, not by some shadowy movie villain in a smoke-filled room, but by a long series of very real decisions made in plain sight by people in charge of the world's money. Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain. Welcome to Hidden Finance, where we decode the money stories you were never meant to notice, expose the incentives behind the headlines, and show you how power really moves in the global economy. If you've ever wondered why everything gets more expensive while your life doesn't feel richer, stay with me. Because to understand your future, you need to understand the 50-year plan that quietly rewrote the rules of money. To see how we got here, we need to go back to a time when inflation was not a given. When the value of a dollar was chained to something solid. After World War II, the world's financial architecture rested on a deal called Bretton Woods. Under this system, most currencies were pegged to the US dollar. And the dollar itself was pegged to gold at a fixed rate, $35 for 1 ounce. This gold link was more than symbolism, it was a brake pedal. It meant the United States couldn't just create endless dollars without consequence. Other countries could demand real gold in exchange. That constraint shaped everything: government spending, wars, welfare programs, and the pace at which prices could rise. Inflation happened, but it was a problem to fight, not a tool to use. By the 1960s, that brake pedal was grinding under pressure. The US was trying to pay for the Vietnam War abroad, while funding the Great Society at home, guns and butter, war and welfare all at once. The government spent more than it collected in taxes, and the Federal Reserve, step by step, supported this with easier money and low interest rates. Dollars poured out into the world, but the gold backing those dollars stayed the same. Foreign governments started to worry. If there were far more dollars than gold, what happened if everyone tried to cash in at once? By the late 1960s, that fear became reality. Countries like France began demanding gold instead of paper dollars. The US gold reserves started to drain. And behind closed doors, a fundamental truth emerged. America could no longer have it all. It couldn't fight a costly war, run ambitious social programs, maintain global power, and keep the dollar fully backed by gold. Something had to give, and instead of cutting spending or raising taxes, leaders made a different choice: change the money itself. On the evening of August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon appeared on television and announced what would later be called the Nixon Shock. In a few carefully crafted sentences, he closed the gold window, suspending the dollar's convertibility into gold. The promise that had underpinned the entire post-war monetary order was broken. To most Americans, it sounded like a technical adjustment, a temporary measure, nothing to worry about. But in practice, the dollar was just transformed from a claim on gold into a claim on nothing but faith and policy. For the first time in modern history, the world's reserve currency floated free, unanchored, and with it, the era of truly controlled inflation quietly died. From that moment forward, governments and central banks had a new kind of power, the ability to create money unconstrained by a fixed quantity of gold. This was not announced as a 50-year plan. No one said, "We are going to slowly inflate away the value of your savings," but the incentives were set. With no hard anchor, every future conflict, crisis, and election would tempt policymakers to choose a little more money and a little more inflation instead of painful cuts or unpopular taxes. Inflation stopped being just a danger, it became useful. The 1970s made that utility painfully visible. Freed from gold, the dollar drifted, and the world was hit with oil shocks, wage price spirals, and supply disruptions. In the US, inflation surged into double digits. Ordinary people saw their paychecks eaten away month after month. Savings accounts, once considered safe, were silently destroyed by rising prices. Politicians blamed speculators, oil producers, greedy corporations, anyone but the basic fact that the monetary anchor had been cut loose. By the end of the decade, something had to change. In 1979, Paul Volcker became chairman of the Federal Reserve and took a brutally simple approach: raise interest rates high enough to force inflation down, no matter the cost. Rates soared above 15%, mortgages became unaffordable. Businesses failed, unemployment surged. It was economic shock therapy. Volcker's move is often remembered as the moment inflation was conquered. But something more subtle happened. The world accepted that some inflation would always be there, so long as it could be managed. In the 1980s and 1990s, a new doctrine quietly took shape. Central banks around the world began to settle on a target, about 2% inflation per year. Not zero, not negative, positive, predictable erosion of money. On the surface, 2% sounded harmless. Who notices a 2% loss each year? But over a working lifetime, that harmless number cuts the value of your money in half. This was the compromise. Inflation would no longer explode into chaos like the 1970s. But it would never again be truly beaten. It would be built into the design. And while measured inflation slowed, something else started to inflate: assets. Stocks, bonds, and especially real estate began a long, powerful climb. In this new era, if you owned assets, inflation didn't just hurt you. It helped you. Your stocks and house rose in price much faster than official inflation. Your debts, fixed in nominal terms, became easier to pay back with cheaper dollars. For those with capital, inflation, managed, predictable, and backed by central banks, became a quiet gift. For those living paycheck to paycheck, it remained a silent thief. At the center of this new world was one institution, the Federal Reserve, led by a new kind of central banker, Alan Greenspan. Throughout the 1990s, Greenspan cultivated an almost mystical reputation. When markets stumbled, like the 1987 crash or the collapse of long-term capital management in 1998, the Fed stepped in, cut rates, and flooded the system with liquidity. Investors learned a powerful lesson: if markets fall too far, the Fed will save them. This became known as the Greenspan put, an unspoken insurance policy underwritten by new money. Once again, inflation was not an accident. It was the price of rescuing markets, of keeping the financial system and asset prices aloft. Meanwhile, something else was quietly holding down the numbers you see on the news. Globalization, offshoring, and cheap imports from countries like China kept the cost of many goods low. Electronics, clothing, and household items got cheaper or better every year. This masked another reality. While your television and smartphone became more affordable, the things you can't import cheaply, housing, healthcare, education, were rising much faster than 2% a year. The official inflation rate said everything was under control. The lived experience of millions said otherwise. Then in the 2000s, the logic of the system pushed even further. After the dot-com bubble burst, interest rates were slashed again to keep the economy afloat. Easy money flowed into housing, fueling a speculative boom in real estate and mortgages. Banks created exotic loans, Wall Street sliced them into complex securities, and the whole world bought into the idea that house prices could only go up. When that fantasy collapsed in 2008, the system didn't reset. It doubled down. The global financial crisis was the real unveiling of the new monetary order. To prevent a full-scale collapse, central banks launched quantitative easing, creating vast sums of new money to buy government bonds and financial assets. Officially, it was all about stability. Unofficially, it cemented a new pattern. When the system is threatened, we do not allow prices, especially asset prices, to fall too far. We respond with more money, more debt, and more support. Again, inflation, at least in consumer prices, did not explode immediately. But the price of assets, stocks, bonds, prime real estate, took off like a rocket. This is where the 50-year plan, whether by design or by accumulated incentives, becomes unmistakable. From 1971 onward, every major crisis reinforced the same message: solve problems not with painful reset and genuine loss, but with cheap money and managed inflation. Governments ran higher debts, confident that inflation would slowly erode what they owed in real terms. Central banks kept rates low, knowing that a little inflation was better than the political chaos of deflation and default. And in the middle of it all, the average saver, the person holding cash in the bank, trusting pensions, working for wages, became the shock absorber of the entire system. By the 2010s, some people started to notice. Why, they asked, did central banks target inflation at all? Why not target stable prices, or even slightly falling ones as technology made things cheaper? The answers were uncomfortable because inflation makes long-term debts easier to bear. Because inflation quietly shifts wealth from lenders to borrowers, and the biggest borrower in the system is always the government. Inflation, in other words, is not just an economic metric, it is a policy tool, a hidden tax, a lubricant that keeps a heavily indebted system running. Then came 2020, a global pandemic shut down economies overnight. To avoid total collapse, governments unleashed historic levels of spending, and central banks created unprecedented sums of new money in response. Stimulus checks, rescue packages, asset purchases, zero interest rates, every lever was pulled to keep demand and markets afloat while supply chains cracked. For a brief moment, the illusion snapped. The scale of money creation was too big, too fast, to ignore, and soon, the inevitable followed. By 2021 to 2022, inflation surged back into the headlines with a vengeance. Prices jumped at the supermarket, at the gas pump, in the housing market. For a new generation, this was the first time inflation felt real. Central banks insisted it was transitory. Then they raised rates, late and sharply, to pull it back under control. But by then, the damage for many was done. Wages lagged, savings eroded, and the cost of basic life milestones, a home, a family, a secure retirement, moved further out of reach. This wasn't random. It was the logical climax of a 50-year pattern. Every crisis answered with more money, more debt, more tolerance for inflation's quiet theft. So, was there truly a secret 50-year plan? Not in the Hollywood sense. There was no single meeting where world leaders signed a document titled the Inflation Plan, but there was, and is, a structure of incentives, a shared worldview, and a playbook. A belief that moderate inflation is good, that debt must be preserved, that markets must be rescued, and that the costs of all this can be spread slowly, invisibly, across decades and across billions of ordinary people. Call it a plan, call it a regime, call it the water we all swim in, the result is the same. Inflation is not an accident. Today, the legacy of this 50-year regime is everywhere. Housing has become an investment vehicle more than a basic human need. Young generations face asset prices inflated by decades of cheap money. Pensions, savings accounts, and bonds often fail to outpace inflation, leaving anyone without significant risk-taking exposed to slow, steady loss. At the same time, the owners of assets, stocks, real estate, businesses have enjoyed one of the greatest wealth booms in history, amplified by every central bank rescue and every round of newly created money. In response, new forms of resistance have emerged. Some turn to gold, the old anchor that once constrained governments. Others embrace Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, seeking digital scarcity beyond the reach of central banks. There's a growing debate over sound money, over whether central banks should exist in their current form, over whether we can keep using inflation as a perpetual tool without eventually breaking trust in the system. Yet for now, the machine continues. Debts are high, growth is modest, and the quiet temptation to solve problems with a little more inflation is always there. Understanding this story doesn't magically protect you from rising prices, but it changes everything about how you see them. You stop asking, why is everything going wrong? And start asking, who benefits from this design? You realize that protecting yourself means thinking like the architects of the system, owning productive assets, avoiding being stuck in cash, and seeing inflation not as weather, but as policy. The plan only works in silence. It loses power the moment you start to see it. Inflation is not just numbers on a chart. It's a 50-year transfer of power, wealth, and control, carried out 1 percentage point at a time. And now that you've seen how it works, you can't unsee it. This is Hidden Finance, where we shine a light on the stories, incentives, and decisions hidden beneath every price tag and paycheck. If this changed how you think about money, don't let the story end here. Keep digging, keep questioning, and keep exploring with us, because in a world built on quiet financial plans, knowledge is your only real hedge. Remember this: inflation is not an accident. And once you understand the plan, you no longer have to be its victim.